How about now?
Yeah, there you go.
Should I start all over again?
Yeah, why don't we, let's start that over again.
Thank you. Okay.
We're very professional here.
My bad, the switch was turned on. Everybody's probably going, I can't hear you at all, John. What the heck's going on? Okay, let's start this all over again. I apologize, everybody. Hey, thank you for joining us today, basically allowing us to have this time with you to explain a little bit of the small UAS systems that are out there. I have with me today our team from Canada, RMUS Canada, who basically have just been killing it up there in Canada. They've been doing such a great job. Kevin Totterall and Fraser Hahn both just doing a great job up there, introducing some of the equipment that we have. But because we've been, asked a number of times, and Kevin knows enough people in the public safety space as well as I do, inspection, corporate, all these different places that we basically talk to people. And the number one thing that we get is basically that, which one is going to be the best for me to buy? This is, again, want to be very clear that this isn't this is the one that's going to be the best one to buy, but we definitely want to discuss the features and capabilities, and the team up there has done a great job basically putting this together. So without further ado, I will introduce Kevin Totterall, who is basically RMUS Canada. He is RMUS Canada. Kevin, how are you?
Fantastic, John. Thank you very much for the warm intro. Great to be here. On my right is our Director of Technology, Fraser Hahn, who will be leading our test and talking a little bit more detail. But what I'd like to do right now to get into this right away is talk a little bit. I'm just going to go through really quickly some of the specs, and then we will go through a little bit of the preamble, and then Fraser will also take it on with our special guest, Andy Olison from Canadian Emergency Responders Robotics Association and Element 3 Robotics. So we'll introduce him shortly. So pretty exciting there. So let me just get through the T dotting and the I crossing, or vice versa. So really, it's never been a more exciting time to be in the UAS space, particularly with the smaller units. Mostly because there's so much choice. Right now, we're going to test these units, and they all are terrific units and are suitable for a variety of different applications. So now it's challenging in that there are more choices and more things we have to consider when we do it, but it's still a great time to be around. So any time when you have choice, now you have questions. Before it was maybe easier. So now you've got to think about what you're going to be doing. So the first thing we want to talk about is just a little bit of some of the caveats of the testing we did. So we have the 4 aircraft, the Skydio 2, the Parrot Anafi USA, the Autel Evo 2 Dual, and the DJI Mavic 2 Enterprise. Now, obviously, the first thing is the Skydio 2 is not the same aircraft as those other ones. So the optimal one for the testing would have been the X2, but I don't think there are too many of those out in the wild, and we weren't able to get our hands on one. So when we get one, we will test them. But obviously, Skydio is something that's on people's minds, and the big thing with Skydio anyway is going to be the obstacle avoidance, and we were able to test that and get a great look at it. So we don't go into the Skydio details too much other than that. So that's the first thing. The second thing is the Anafi USA. We have one of the very first units off the very, very first production run of that aircraft. And it was really, really fun to be kind of the Chuck Yeagers. But we also have to look at it is that this is an extremely, extremely new platform. You can't get any newer. And so, like anything else, there are still a couple of early production bugs in it. It flew very well. And there's already been an update on the FreeFly app that came out yesterday. So it is not as mature a platform, obviously, as either the Autel or the Mavic 2 Enterprise Dual. So just there. And then the final caveat on this is the mapping aspects of each. We're not going to show maps on here with them. None of these aircraft are really optimal for mapping unless you're going to try, I should say mapping in PIX or any of those comparable products, just because of the sensor type. Certainly the Autel is the best of the three for doing that, but you're not buying those other aircraft necessarily to do mapping. We do have data sets and mapping stuff that we'll share if you're interested later, but it's important to understand that. Having said that, we really love the Skybrowse app. So that uses video. So we're looking forward to testing some of these in the Skybrowse app. So just before I pass along to Fraser, let's just do a quick recap of some of the specs of the aircraft. So we've got the Autel Evo 2 Dual, and that has the highest resolution. It's got a 640 res IR camera with 48 megapixel stills, 8x digital zoom, temperature range 0 Celsius to 40 degrees Celsius, tops wind resistance of 40 miles an hour, 64K, 2.4 gig transmission, published transmission range 9K. Another little caveat, those are optimal conditions, so none of these aircraft got anywhere near their published ranges, which we'll talk about in the test. It doesn't mean they're bad people. It just means we tested in the real world. But anyway, published 9K. It does not have no fly zones like the DJI, full 360 obstacle avoidance. And then the pricing. This is the unit cost of $10,000 US for the whole aircraft kit, including all the batteries, or 13.6 Canadian. The Anafi USA is 320 res IR sensor, 21 megapixel still camera with 32x digital zoom, minus 35 degrees Celsius to 40 C range. So for us in Canada, that's huge. It's by far the largest operating range of any small aircraft. 33 mile an hour, 52 mile an hour wind resistance. Talk a little bit more about that. And 2.4 and 5.8 gig transmission, 4 kilometer transition range. No fly zones also. Every security feature you could imagine. No obstacle avoidance, but it's also the only one that's IP rated, IP53 rated. So both the Parrot and the Autel have manufactured in the USA status, if that's something that is important to you. Mavic 2 Enterprise Dual, 160 sensor on the IR, 12 megapixel camera. As of the update yesterday, now a 4x digital zoom, though we did not test it with that. Minus 10 to plus 40 Celsius temperature range, 24 mile an hour, 38 wind resistance, 2.4, 5.8 megapixel, 2.4, 5.8 gigahertz transmission, 8K. Has some fun stuff. Obviously, the only one currently with accessories, the Spotlight, for example. Full MSX on the IR. And the ability of a smart controller and full 360 obstacle. So important to note, the unit we test was the smart controller option, and the pricing on that with the Fly More kit and the smart controller is going to be $4,300 US, $5,400 Canadian. You can see we've got quite a price range in the decision. And last note on the pricing on the Skydio, the Skydio 2 is tested. With the kit will be about US $2,500. If you wanted to get an X2 reasonably kitted out, that is going to run you somewhere around 16,000 to 17,000 US without the software. So that will be, on the high end of the range. So again, not to make your decision process easy. You've got a big range in terms of what you're thinking about there. So that's the basics. So with all that said, I'm going to pass it along to Fraser and Andy to discuss the test results. So let's start with a quick introduction from Andy so you can hear our kind of expert panels.
Oh,
Hold on. There we go.
should be good. Still can't hear him.
I don't have him. Is he muted?
We good now?
Yep.
Oh,
There we go.
Perfect. Okay. So quick introduction. Andy Olson spent 30 years in law enforcement. 2009, we were the third agency in North America to be licensed to operate drones. So I took over our drone program. Started a company, Element 3 Robotics. And recently here, we also formed a new Public Safety Association for Robotics, Canadian Emergency Responders Robotics Association. So that deals primarily with drones, but also the ground and the water robots as well. So I appreciate the invite here and the opportunity to test these systems. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Andy. So as Kevin mentioned, my name's Fraser. I'm the Director of Tech for RMUS Canada. I do our service and support work here. So if you're a Canadian RMUS customer, I'm sure we'll be in contact at some point. Okay, so why do we test these systems? Well, they're all similar in some ways. They're all small. They fold up for portability. They all have thermal capability, and they're all intended for enterprise applications. So they're all in the same category. And as Kevin said, this category is changing fast. There's been some exciting developments already this year, and we'll have more again next year. So they're pretty similar in some ways, but we can see right off the bat that there are some serious differences. The Mavic 2 Enterprise is the only one of the ones we tested that comes with the payload accessories that Kevin mentioned. That's the spotlight, the speaker, and the beacon. The Autel may be available here in this market with similar accessories soon, but we're not exactly sure when that may happen. So the Mavic is available with the Smart Controller, which is this here, which we think is a really great option. That makes it more of a closed system, so you don't have to worry about compatibility issues with your phone, and you can avoid delays in deployment thanks to the Smart Controller. The Mavic 2 has been used for over 2 years, and it's considered reliable and resilient. So that's great. The Autel Evo 2, as you can see, it's orange. That's nice because it's visible from both below and above. It's bigger and heavier than the Mavic, noticeably so, and you can feel that a little bit in the flight characteristics. The controller has some great features. I'm thinking mainly of being able to adjust camera settings and other similar features without taking your hands off the controller, so there's no need to take your hands off the sticks and interact with the touchscreen. That's really nice. The Autel Explorer app is also really similar to the DJI app, so anyone who's familiar with flying DJI systems will also find the Autel app intuitive. The NFE USA is the smallest of the aircraft we tested. It's significantly smaller than either the Mavic or the Autel, and likely will be smaller than the Skydio as well. It comes in a smaller travel case, and also 3 batteries are included with that. This controller that the NFE USA comes with feels a little better in your hands. It's more ergonomic than the Autel controller, but it still requires that you use a smartphone. And the app that you fly the Parrot with, the Parrot Free Flight 6 app, it's not quite so similar to the DJI app or the Autel app, but it's equally intuitive. And actually, if you're entirely new to using drones, you might find that the Parrot app is more accessible. So, Andy, could you just give us your first impressions of the systems when you encountered them?
Sure. Thanks, Fraser. First impressions, I think right out of the box, they all appear to be really well made. I think people that are looking for this kind of system or agencies are looking for something that's probably going to be easily deployable so that you're not attaching arms and propellers and assembling it. So these all came in a really nice portable case and were really quick to set up. Of the three, probably the best system for setup was probably the Mavic Enterprise. And like Fraser said, mainly I think because of the smart controller, which is like dedicated to the system itself. Cell phones and tablets are great, but as you know, sometimes when you're flying, if you don't have your notifications shut off, you get phone messages or phone calls, and that doesn't happen on the smart controller. Things like running out of battery on a smart controller, it was easy to just insert a new battery and you're up and running again. And unless you have another phone or a tablet, you're going to be waiting to charge it. Another thing we found was a lot of agencies, if you have multiple systems, to be able to transition quickly is important. So if you already have DJI, going from Mavic Enterprise to an M210 or an M300 is pretty easy. As Fraser said, the hotel was also pretty intuitive. So that was definitely a factor in the 3 as well. Thanks, Fraser.
All right, thanks, Andy. Some good points there. I'll add to your note about deployment time. The Mavic is exceptionally fast to deploy. Even the IMU or attitude initialization happens really quickly. The Mavic doesn't even seem to mind if you move it during the boot up sequence. So you can power it on in your hand, place it on the ground, and then it's pretty much ready to fly. It really stands out in that regard. Okay, so we'll jump into some tests. So I'll just share my screen here with you. And we'll start with getting some things out of the way that I know that everybody is interested to hear about. So starting with the flight times. So we did this test in real world conditions. We didn't do it indoors. The temperature was around freezing, which is a challenge for lithium batteries. And there was some moderate wind. The wind was maybe 7 or 8 knots. And how we did this test is that we ascended as quickly as possible, right up to 150 feet, and then just hovered there until the battery reached 20%, which is when we would normally come home. So when the battery reached 20%, we ended the test and called time there. The results came out more or less what we expected. These landed in the same order as the manufacturer specifications, with the NFE USA achieving 28.5 minutes, the Evo 2, 27.5, and the Mavic 2 Enterprise about 23.5 minutes. There were no accessories on the Mavic at the time. Those would further reduce your flight time. As I said, we did this test in real world conditions. We had some wind, we had cold weather, and so obviously the results are not quite as good as the manufacturer specifications. But this is what we expect in real world conditions, so no real surprises here. The next test we'll talk about is range. And again, the results are in line with what we can expect from the manufacturer specifications. The test was done at max altitude, so 400 feet AGL, just to avoid obstacles in the way of our transmission when we got out to longer ranges. But there still were some trees between our aircraft and the remote controller. So very realistic scenario. And the Autel Evo 2 Dual achieved the longest range. And the Mavic was second best, achieving 91% of the range that the Evo got. And then with the NFE USA, achieving about 64% of the range that the Evo got. These aren't anywhere near the manufacturer's published specifications. There's humidity in the air. Pretty much any environmental condition that equates to the real world is going to prevent you from getting the ranges that we see on websites and so on. Those just don't happen in the real world. So now we're going to look at the sensors a little bit. The first test we did indoors, and it's just to look at the visual capabilities of the sensors. So this is the Mavic 2 Enterprise. It doesn't have any ability to zoom digitally. Now it does, but at the time of the test it didn't. So this is a fully zoomed out view of our test range. And what we have is a series of targets placed at 50 feet, at 100 feet, and at 135 feet. So the Mavic, having the lowest resolution sensor, it didn't have digital zoom at the time. It has digital zoom now, but its potential for digital zoom is not as good as the other systems, so it's not likely to succeed very well at this test. We can accept that, not a big problem. This is a shot from the Evo 2 Dual, and this is sort of the best look that was achieved by the Evo 2 Dual. So this target is 50 feet away. We're zoomed in as far as possible using digital zoom on the auto, which is 8 times. And we can see sub-inch detail at 100 feet away. That's fairly impressive. But the NFV USA did considerably better than that. This is the same target we just looked at. It's 50 feet away, and the NFV USA is doing a much better job of getting us close to that target. We can see well below centimeter level detail from quite far away. That's really impressive. And it gets better. This target is 100 feet away. And as you can see, we're still seeing very, very good detail. The next one's 135 feet away, and we're still seeing a lot of good detail. So obviously the visual zoom capability of the NFV USA is really impressive, and it stood out a lot in this test. So Andy, can you just give us some comments on what you thought of the results here, and why is it important for public safety drone operators to be able to zoom in this far?
Sure, thanks, Fraser. So what we wanted to do, obviously we're not scientists or professional researchers, but we wanted to create an environment where we could properly evaluate the systems using the same standards. So these systems were actually on a table, and we used the warehouse because it was sort of a good situational setting for it. So they weren't flying, so there was no concern about their ability to maneuver indoors. We used the targets. Some of you might recognize them from NIST, National Institute of Standards and Technology, part of their standard test methodology targets. And the idea was just to be able to compare the systems, and also for us to understand what their strengths and weaknesses are in certain areas, and how to use the interface. So that was the purpose of the test.
Awesome, thanks, Andy. So I'm just going to share the screen again with you here, and we can talk about why the NFV USA is so good at digital zoom, or I should say just at zoom generally in the visible spectrum. So we know that it doesn't have optical zoom. It doesn't have lens elements moving in and out. That would add a lot of weight. It's not really practical for such a small aircraft. What it's doing is using software to combine the image from a fairly wide angle lens and from a fairly narrow lens. So this is a technology that a lot of cell phone manufacturers are using, and it's really interesting to see Parrot bring that to the UAS space. It seems to work really well. The results were great, very impressive. There are a couple of, well, we'll see more good results and at least one interesting implication of using this hybrid zoom technology. So the next test was essentially the same, but we're looking at the thermal capability of these systems. So the aircraft are stationary. We're using thermal sensor to try to see essentially as far as we can and take a look at what kind of detail we're getting at longer distances. Again, the Mavic has the lowest resolution thermal sensor, so we would expect it to not perform quite so well in this test, and that's what we found. That subject is 50 feet away. We can still tell that they're a person and roughly what posture they're standing in. And we can also see something else going on here on the screen. Kevin touched on the MSX capability of the Mavic. That's a feature that blends thermal and visual data to give us more information about the scene. Here, for example, we can see that there are those warehouse racks on the left and some other obstacles on the right. We probably wouldn't see that stuff in a purely thermal image, but because we're seeing some visual data, we're getting better situational awareness in the whole scene. This next shot is with the Evo 2 Dual, okay? And that subject is way, way further away than in the picture we just looked at. That subject is 135 feet away. And what we're seeing is the result of the high resolution sensor on the Evo 2 Dual. Its thermal sensor is by far the highest resolution of those we tested, and this is the results that we get from that. Very good resolution for a thermal camera. We can clearly see that that's a person, that what posture they're in, and so that's quite impressive. This last shot is with the NFV USA. It's also using a feature that blends thermal and visual data, and we can see here how helpful that is, because we can certainly see the thermal signature. That thermal signature is not nearly as crisp as it was with the Autel because the resolution of that sensor is lower. But by zooming in really far and using the helpful addition of some visual data, we can actually see a lot more about what's going on there. We can even see that the subject is holding a pen. It's actually a little hard it's a little hard to see that in the video quality that you may be getting on your end, but I can assure you that we can see quite clearly what's being held in that subject's hand. Okay, so I'm not entirely clear on who the winner is in this test. I do really appreciate that combining visual and thermal data is extremely helpful in a case like this, and the NFE USA lets you do that at quite a distance by zooming in digitally, so that's quite helpful. Andy, what about you? Any thoughts on the results there? Did anything stand out to you?
Yeah, thanks, Fraser. One of the things we found was the Autel, its strength is definitely its IR resolution, its thermal resolution. That was very impressive, as well as the 8-time zoom. Some of the maybe the downsides of it didn't have the blended MSX type technology. We found it was a relatively small field of view. So what you're seeing in the on your tablet, the actual area is smaller than the other two. None of these cameras are radiometric, so you can't take any of the images and do any post editing in either the FLIR or the any of the aftermarket or any of the programs that are available to do that. So it's really a question of the Parrot, like Fraser mentioned, was really good to be able to do the blending with the zoom and the thermal. That was nice. But then it wasn't easy to change palettes. So if you want to change palettes, how the screen looks, the other two, the Autel and the Mavic, were really easy to switch. The Parrot took a few steps to be able to do the same thing. So the Mavic, when it does come out with the new software and gives you the ability to have the 4-time digital zoom, that will probably greatly enhance it. So I think, like Fraser mentioned, it kind of comes down to knowing what you want out of a system and where you're going to apply it, and picking a system based on that. Thanks, Fraser.
No problem. Some good points there, Andy. Yeah, I'll mention now that so switching between thermal and visible spectrums on the Parrot takes a little longer than you might like, and changing thermal settings is easiest with the Autel. Like, you can change color palettes without even taking your hands off the controller. Use a scroll wheel on the shoulder of the controller for that. So that's very handy. I'll just share this again with you, and we'll jump into the next test that we did, which is similar to the indoor visual test, except that we're outdoors. We've got an ADR camera angle, so we're looking straight down, and we can get a little further away here. Also, we've got daylight lighting conditions. Okay, as we already know by now, the Mavic's sensor just has the lowest resolution, so it's not likely to do the best in this test, and that's okay. Again, in this test, we're looking at the NIST targets that Andy described, because they give us an ability to test the visual acuity for fine detail, but also to look at how sort of realistically those colors are being reproduced. So this is a shot from the Evo 2 Dual at 200 feet. We're zoomed all the way in. The Autel Evo 2 Dual gives us up to 8 times digital zoom, and that's the kind of detail we can get. Again, I'll mention that I'm seeing on my screen a much clearer image than you guys may be on your end. So you may have to just take my word for it here, but you will be able to download these files later on. And anyone who wants to see them sooner than later can email us just to ask. So from 200 feet up with the Autel, we can see color very well. We're not really seeing very much fine detail. That center target that has the rings with openings in them, those are intended to see how fine a detail we can see, and it's not super impressive at this range. However, the NFE USA, perhaps obviously now, does a much better job of that. Its ability to zoom in, I think, up to 32 times, really makes it helpful in scenarios like this. So as we can see, we're seeing what's probably around sub-inch detail The opening in that first ring is an inch, maybe an inch and a half across, and we're seeing pretty crisp edges there. So that's rather impressive. Also, color reproduction seems fine. Again, in my opinion, the NFE USA stands out in this test. It's a pretty clear winner, in my opinion. It just zooms in visually way further and better than the other systems can. Andy, anything to add to that?
Yeah, thanks, Fraser. Yeah, one of the things I think for those that are new to the drone systems is sometimes people don't understand that as great as an image from a drone is, sometimes they can't pick up things as well as the human eye, and different cameras obviously see things differently. So that's what we want to reproduce in this test to understand the color spectrum. And as Fraser mentioned, I think also the difference between optical and digital zoom is important to know on your systems. And then the difference, if you don't have zoom, the Parrot and Nafi at 32 zoom, with a Mavic Enterprise that didn't have the zoom, we had to get in much closer to see the same thing that we could at a much greater distance, having that zoom capability. And then obviously the Autel at 8x zoom fell in the middle there. So it was another good understanding of us to understand how the different systems work in different settings. Thanks, Fraser.
No problem. So we'll just talk a little bit about these files, because you will not be able to see the same quality that we see. So if you're interested in taking a closer look, please do download the files when they're available. And if you're interested in assessing these systems for their value as inspection tools, you'll definitely want to download the files, zoom in on them, take a close look at individual pixels, and just assess them the same way you would your inspection data. That will be available to you. Okay, back into this these slides. This is I'm just looping back to point out some files that we want to show you here, because we found something interesting in this test. This is not shot from as far away as the images we looked at earlier. We're looking at images from the NFE USA. They're both from the NFE USA, and they're both from the same altitude and similar zoom level. This image here is a little bit more zoomed out than this image here. But the image we're looking at now is crisper. That's odd. You might be asking yourself why that's the case, because the more we zoom in, the worse the results we should expect to see. But there's something interesting going on. So the NFE USA gives us the ability to zoom in continuously with a lever on the shoulder of the controller. But the optimization that's achieved by the hybrid zoom is not continuous. It happens in stages. And that's what happened here. So as we zoomed in very slightly, the image actually got much crisper. That was an interesting find for us. What it means for you in the field using the NFE USA is just that if something doesn't seem quite as good as you'd expect it to be, try zooming in a tiny bit or try zooming out a tiny bit. You may actually improve the results quite a bit. Okay, so our next test also is outdoors, and it's another test of the thermal capabilities. We tried to do a test purely of the function of the thermal sensors here. So we didn't use any of the features that are only available on one system but not the others. We used white hot palette because it's available on all of them. We just tried to make this as apples to apples of a comparison as we could. So again, the results are perhaps kind of predictable. We can see that the Mavic 2 Enterprise with the lowest resolution sensor is just showing us kind of a warm blob. We can't even really determine for sure whether that's a person or not. It's just, it doesn't perform as well as the others. That shot with the Mavic was at 75 feet. We actually felt with the two others that we could move up a little bit. So the shot you see from the NFE USA is from 100 feet in the air. We can tell that that's likely a person, and we can infer what their posture is. With the Evo 2 Dual, we can see that it's a person. We can see what posture they're in. On my screen here, I can even see some identifying features like that they're wearing a hat and probably eyeglasses. So to be able to tell that from 100 feet up with just thermal data is actually really, really impressive. Again, that's the Autel's high resolution sensor showing us its worth. It's also got a fairly narrow field of view on the thermal sensor, which is just putting more pixels on your target. But you might think that a narrow field of view, that must mean that it's covering a narrower ground swath during a search pattern. And then you have to do a tighter search pattern, and then this will all take longer. That is the case, except that you could just fly higher. So if you fly higher, you're covering more ground quicker. And that's really what this configuration of a high resolution sensor with a narrow field of view is giving you, is options. Because you can fly higher and see sort of okay detail and cover lots of ground, or you can fly lower and see this kind of fine detail that we're seeing here. And those of you who've done search patterns with the thermal sensor on the Mavic 2 Enterprise ought to be very impressed with how clear that image looks from the Evo 2 Dual. So again, the Evo 2 Dual's got the best thermal sensor. It shouldn't be surprising that it wins in this test. And here are some results. It's quite impressive. Okay, Andy, what did you think about the results here? I know there's nothing really surprising, but what's the applicability of this to real-world scenarios? Like, how important is it to have a good thermal function on a small system like this?
I think, like you said, Fraser, I think it's just important to understand what it is you want to do. The resolution of the Autel is impressive if you need that much detail, and if you don't think you can get in that close. As we'll find out in some of the other tests we did, there are some equalizing factors with the Mavic that sort of made up for some of its shortcomings. But like we said, this kind of comes down to knowing what it is you want to do with the systems.
Yeah, makes good sense. So the next test we want to go over is an urban search scene at night. But so far we focused on tests that just try to compare the systems directly to each other. But they don't work in exactly the same way. Some of them have features that others don't. And so when we do apples to apples comparisons, we're kind of constraining the systems a little bit. And now we're going to just kind of take the reins off and let them perform optimally. So we'll take advantage of the tools, features that they do have to get the best results. So I'll just show you this here. We're going to use this scene here to assess the value of these systems for a nighttime search. Again, starting with this shot from the Mavic 2 Enterprise. The thermal resolution is not great, so as we can see, there's sort of limited value to the information we have on screen here. We can definitely see a few thermal signatures, but we can't really tell what they are because that resolution is just not great. Fortunately, the Mavic has this MSX feature, which can be really, really helpful. And here we see it highlighting the hard edges. So MSX is helping us here get much greater situational awareness. We can see that those, in fact, are dumpsters and that the thermal signature seems to be hiding behind them. But still, we can't really tell much about that thermal signature. It kind of just looks like a blob because the resolution of the thermal sensor just isn't that great. On the other hand, the Autel Evo 2 Dual has really great thermal resolution, and so we can see a bit more detail on that subject. Again, this is a slide where you are not likely to see such good detail on your end, but the results here are pretty good. The Autel's thermal sensor allows us to digitally zoom in, and by changing palettes and zooming in a bit here, we're getting an even better look at that subject. We can see that it's a person, we can see their posture. They don't appear to be threatening or in any kind of distress. And I think we can deduce that they're not holding any kind of a major large weapon or anything like that. So here's the best result achieved in this test by the NFE USA. We know that the thermal resolution is not quite as good as the Autel, but it does have the feature that blends thermal and visual data. And that's what we're seeing here. It really helps us get an overall impression of the scene. We can see the thermal signature, and we can see some sort of relatively fine detail of the rest of the environment around them. And on my screen here, I can even see that that person is holding something in their hands. You may be able to see that as well. I'm just not quite sure. So just putting these up side by side here, this one's going to be fairly open to interpretation. I think I'd have to give it to the NFE USA. This seems to be a good, sorry, I'm just going to go back here. That seems to be a good compromise between the thermal quality and the blended view feature that's available only on the NFE and the Mavic. Andy, I wanted to see if you thought differently. What did you think about the results of that test?
I agree with you, Fraser. I think the only downside for the Parrot, again, was in the app and the ability to cycle through different color palettes, which can often be handy. And you can do it on the Parrot, like you said before. It's just not quite as easy to do as on the other systems. But other than that, I agree with. I would agree with you.
Go ahead.
So I did
cool.
want to maybe make one small discussion here, which is a great comparison, by the way, looking at this. And this is just an overall understanding, again, with the actual MSX, excuse me, blending an actual RGB camera. If you didn't have really great lighting overall, then your MSX and your blending may not work that great. So just something to note, Fraser. I know you, it wasn't something you specifically addressed, but we've had that question a lot. So RGB is 100% based on the ambient light. And I noticed that in your test here, which is great, that you have a little bit of ambient light in the parking lot. So it will show up very well. But if you're in a completely dark area, you're going to be 100% depending on the resolution of the thermal camera, because you may not have that type of ambient light. So just something of note, Fraser. That was all.
John, that's actually some awesome foreshadowing. Thank you for bringing up that point, because we're going to see the value of lighting in MSX later. And actually, I want to show you these images again, because while I do think the NFE USA is the winner here, the blended view, so the way that the NFE blends visual and thermal data doesn't appear to work quite as well as the MSX function on the Mavic in low light. And that is because the Mavic is actually significantly better in low light conditions. The Mavic's visual camera is better in low light conditions than the Autel or the NFE USA. So that's why its MSX function performs a little better in low light. It's important to note that that's likely only to be the case in a low light scenario. But that is important to note. Thank you very much, John. Okay, so the next test we did was a simulation of an outdoor rural search. Okay, so this is the search scene you're seeing here. It's kind of a mixed environment. There's some loose tree cover, some clear areas, a creek, and so on. And we just let this test subject wander around freely and tried to find them. They were wearing winter clothing, which kind of insulates their thermal signature against our sensors. So this was actually slightly challenging test. It wasn't as easy or straightforward as some of the others we showed you. Okay, so again, with this test, we kind of just played around with the settings that each system has to try to achieve the best result, and then locate the subject the most easily. And here we're looking at some images from the Evo 2 Dual and the NFE USA. I hope they look okay on your end, but what we're seeing is that we can see okay detail, but that's not really what this test was about. The test was about how easy it is to detect that subject. And the result there was kind of surprising. So I mentioned that we kind of played around with settings and stuff. So we got a little creative here. With the Mavic, we employed MSX, and we tried a variety of color palettes. And then we put the spotlight on the Mavic to improve the function of MSX in low light. And that's what really made the difference. It helped us detect movement in the scene, because using the visual data combined with the thermal data, and by illuminating the scene to improve the function of MSX, we were able to see the legs moving and the sort of whole shape of the person moving. And that caught our attention and brought us in on the target. So that's an interesting result. I think it might surprise a lot of people. And it's also important to note that that the result may not be the same in all conditions. Probably the smart controller's large and clear screen also played a role here, because it's important to remember that this test was based on what we were seeing at the time in the field on our screens. Okay, so that's a subjective experience based on the conditions at the time, and we're not really able to convey that to you visually, but everyone who was there agreed with it and they were surprised by it. So very interesting result. John, I just wanted to see if this surprises you or what you think about that. And would you have done anything differently with the settings to try to get a good result?
No, I mean, like I said, it's a very powerful combination, being able to put both of those sensors together. So, you know, surprisingly, it's not very surprising to me. Most people discount any level of low resolution to just be it's terrible, you know, because there's something out there that's better. And that's not always the case, depending on exactly how the environmental conditions are, depending on the subject, you know. You have a standing subject, and we deal with a lot, and out in the middle of the woods, we deal with a lot of, you know, heated up rocks here in Utah. So these environments definitely have some bearing on exactly how you would use or utilize the specific sensors. So everybody, again, wants to get the highest number of sensor, the biggest resolution that they can get. But if it doesn't equate with the other sensors to help out, and clearly you've demonstrated that, then, you know, it's not surprising that one could be a little bit better than the other when using that portion. So.
Yeah, and actually, thanks for bringing that up. So the test was conducted sort of right after dark when the environment was still cooling down. And that's challenging for thermal search because the background is not all the same color. It's not all the same temperature. Different materials cool down at different speeds. And so, you know, right after dark, you get a sort of a complex thermal environment. It's not super easy to search in. It's easy to fall into the trap of thinking that a person is just going to stand out. They're going to shine really brightly in a thermal sensor, but that's not always the case. You need to adjust the parameters, you know, according to the setting, and it sometimes just doesn't work that well, period. So thermal cameras are not magic. Low resolution can achieve good results, and you've got to use them properly.
Yeah, I was going to note as well, again, with the environment, I actually have a slide with a 640 imager with a person sitting right on top of a rock here in Utah at 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting on the rock, and you cannot tell without really getting up close to him that anybody's even there. So you bring up a very valid point when it comes down to a search and rescue or rescue type aspect. So.
Okay, awesome. So Andy, like I said, this was a surprising result to everyone. What did you think about it?
Yeah, I agree with what you guys are saying. I think, like you said, the smart controller was definitely a huge advantage in this. The quality of the screen. Some of the other features that didn't show up on the picture is DJI has the ability to put like spot meters, so you can actually tell the different temperatures within an area. And the other thing we noticed using the spotlight too is the ability to see a shadow. So like you said, you can blend the thermal and the RGB camera, and you also, even at night, because you have a spotlight on, you have the potential to see an object shadow, which can also help you decide on what the object is. So yeah, those are just my add-ons, but I agree with everything you said.
Awesome. Yeah, as I think you pointed out, the smart controller can be really helpful at times. That goes for any large, bright, and clear screen, but in this case, it's the smart controller that had that, so it seemed to help a lot in that scenario. Okay, so we'll move on now and talk about the flight characteristics and obstacle avoidance capabilities of these systems. I tend to think of the Mavic flight characteristics almost as the default, so it's hard for me to talk about them, actually. Generally, we can say that it's very stable in flight, it's pretty quick, it's very responsive, even snappy. It air brakes and changes direction very quickly. Overall, it gives a really good impression and gives lots of confidence to the pilot. Its obstacle avoidance system works on all sides, including top and bottom, and it also works in low light, which is not true of the Autel, so that's important to note. Basically, how obstacle avoidance works is when the aircraft detects an obstacle nearby, it starts to slow down. When it gets to about 8 feet away, it stops very abruptly. In the case of the Mavic, it's very abrupt. And then it just won't go any further, it won't go any closer to that object. The Mavic will go through doorways 8 feet or wider, approximately. So that's anything like a loading dock, door, garage doors, some larger double doors. Should be able to go through there no problem without turning the system off, and that can be helpful, obviously, transitioning from indoors to outdoors and stuff like that. The Autel's flight characteristics and the function of its obstacle avoidance are pretty similar to the Mavic. It's a bigger aircraft. It's a little more sluggish, although that's not really the right word. It's just not quite as responsive. But on the flip side, it tends to handle wind a little better, being just larger and heavier. It feels just as good to fly as the Mavic, and I would give that a very high rating. The obstacle avoidance system also works in a very similar way. It slows you down when you get close to an obstacle, but it slows you down more than I would like it to. So my opinion is that that's kind of a limitation. The Mavic doesn't slow you down quite as much. Also, if you're surrounded by a couple of obstacles with the Mavic, you can usually yaw the aircraft to a heading that will let you fly straight out. Whereas with the Autel, it's going to keep you flying slowly until you're well clear of all the obstacles. Okay, so the ANFI USA, it's a smaller aircraft. You can tell that when you're flying. It tends to get jostled a bit by the winds, but that's not really a major problem unless you're zoomed all the way in. If you're zoomed all the way in, you may see your camera framing get bumped around a little bit. I do need to call something out about the ANFI's specs because we did have a bit of difficulty flying in really high winds, although we pushed to higher winds than we would have with the other systems. So the Parrot's rated to fly in 33-mile-an-hour winds, which is quite impressive. But its rated top speed is also 33 miles per hour. And that's unfortunately not really how this works. If you can only fly as fast as the current wind speed, that means you can't fly upwind, and you may not be able to get home. So if the top horizontal speed of the aircraft is the same as the wind tolerance of the aircraft, there's some disconnect, and we'll try to find clarification on that. One of the things I really, really liked about the ANFI USA's flight characteristics is that the interface allows you to adjust those characteristics pretty much at will to customize the flight experience to yourself. So you can set the max pitch and roll angles. You can set the max horizontal and vertical speeds, and that's really nice. Myself, as I've had a lot of time flying drones before, so I really enjoy being able to push it. You can save those settings on up to 4 presets, and those presets reside on your smartphone. So every operator for your ANFI USA can basically have up to 4 personalized preset flight modes, each to themselves, and that's really cool. I just want to go back to this slide for a second, show you guys one thing. So here's, an example of a doorway. Both the ANFI, both the Autel and the Mavic were able to fly through that doorway with the obstacle avoidance sensors turned on. We did not need to turn them off. The ANFI USA could equally fly through there. If you're a competent pilot, you can do that. Obstacle avoidance is not something you need to worry about when flying indoors. On the right side of the screen, you can see a series of vertical barriers. Now, this is in our warehouse, and we use this kind of plane of vertical barriers to test the obstacle avoidance capability. So basically, when the Mavic approached this plane of vertical barriers, it would not go through. It just stopped, and we had to move around. It would not go through. The Autel came up to this barrier, it stopped, it slowed down, and then it proceeded very slowly to go through the gaps. Basically, we had to just slide up and down the plane a little bit, and then the aircraft seemed to find its way through and would proceed. We're going to talk about the Skydio, of course, because flight characteristics and obstacle avoidance are the only function of that system we were really able to test, and they perform amazingly well. So the Skydio can fly through this complex environment full of obstacles basically without slowing down. It goes through in a very fluid way. Even its automated flight programs like following a person function very well in an environment like this. It just seems like the thing could never, ever crash. And it doesn't really impede its maneuverability either. It's pretty amazing. So Andy, can you give us your thoughts on the flight characteristics and the function of the obstacle avoidance systems? And since you probably have more time flying the Skydio than any of us, could you just emphasize that a little bit more?
Sure. Yeah, I think I don't think I can add anything more to what you said on the other systems. Like you said, I maybe have a little more time on the Skydio. So overall, it's a very well-made system. Some of the control functions aren't quite as crisp as the other systems. Like when you want to stop, it doesn't stop quite as crisply or turn quite as crisply. The artificial intelligence, its obstacle avoidance is really impressive, especially outside. Its ability to track and follow a subject around anything and detect poles and buildings and wires is really impressive. On the downside, though, if you have that ability, it means you can't put prop guards on because prop guards would impair that sensor. So flying indoors, you'd have to turn the system off, or it wouldn't be really practical to use because you wouldn't be able to get into doorways. It also didn't work well in low or no light situations, again, because it has those phenomenal sensors, but they need the light to be able to navigate around and function. And if you turn those sensors off, then you've lost a big part of the advantage of it. So overall, Skydio 2, really well-made system. Definitely has some advantages, definitely some disadvantages, but I think taking that technology forward into the X2, as we said, we're really excited to see that and what it's going to bring and how it will compare to the other systems. Thanks, Fraser.
Awesome, thank you, Andy. So just to kind of wrap up our thoughts here, we all know like living and working with drones involves occasional headaches. And so going through the test, a few things happened that we wanted to share with you because they're a valid part of the experience. We ran into a firmware update for the Mavic Smart Controller. It failed to download a bunch of times, and that caused a delay of like 2 hours. So we could have ignored that and just moved on, but firmware updates are a part of the experience, and we wanted to share that with you. It can be a headache. The Autel got stepped on outdoors. It was in a dark parking lot at night. Somebody stepped on it. We won't name any names. And it was totally fine. There was no real damage. We changed the propeller, and it was good as new. So that's very impressive. And then we need to acknowledge that, as Kevin said, the Parrot ANP USA is a brand new system. It's got some minor teething issues. Some of the automated functions didn't work quite as well as we would like, and we expect that to be well handled shortly. Okay, so just some final thoughts. The Mavic, as we've said, it's a solid, reliable system. It's very versatile. It's the lowest cost of the ones that we've tested. It's a good, really good all-around system, and of course, it's got the included payload accessories. So that's really nice. As of now, there's nothing else available for the others. John, can you add something?
I did. I actually have a couple of questions from the crowd, if you will. Nothing super crazy. I mean, I think that you guys have done a very well done presentation here. All of the comparisons plus the bonuses. It's overall good. So usually when we don't have a whole lot of questions, that usually means that you did a really great job when we have so many people watching. So great job. Anyway, just for a couple though. And this might be, again, a little bit more of the perspective of search and rescue. So from Jeff C635, were you able to pinpoint the location of a target via a GPS coordinate on each of the UAVs? Which is a good question. One that we get commonly is like, yeah, I can fly the drone out, I can see somebody, but I need to alert everyone else where that person is. If I had a GPS coordinate of exactly where that person was or where the drone was, how easy is that to show up between the three drones? If you have any insight on that, as far as the three major drones in a search and rescue capacity.
Yeah, I can definitely talk about that. So this assumes that we've already located the target and we want to just give the GPS coordinates to that target to someone. We want to share those coordinates. So I guess there's two parts. The Mavic camera gives you the tilt angle of the camera. I think that's particularly important for lots of applications, from inspection, but also to this one. If you're going to give someone the GPS coordinates, you want to have that camera exactly at 90 degrees. If it's at 89 or 91, is that really a problem? Not necessarily, but if you're high up, it's just causing inaccuracy. So seeing the 90-degree camera angle is important. You then position yourself right over the target. The Mavic would give you the most accessible way to get those coordinates. It's quickest to get to with the Mavic. That would be my comment on that.
And then we have just one more, and I know we didn't. I mean, this is not so much in the in some of the stuff you've actually talked about here, but basically in any type of, and I can just go ahead and answer this one. How well does the EVO and AFI2 work for conducting roof, window leaks, and solar farm inspections? And I think overall, when we're talking about comparison in thermal, you know, we want as much information as we possibly can. Anytime we have a lower resolution sensor, definitely trying to get closer to an object is where we want to be. But this also increases our time if we're doing anything like following a roof or going down solar panels. This will increase our time because now we've just shortened how much field of view that we actually have to observe the actual anomalies that we see within solar panels or anything else. So even though we haven't really discussed that in the actual test today, that is an advantage, disadvantage as far as being able to have the field of view and make a good assessment on an anomaly you might see. And that's probably true with all of the actual thermal sensors that are out there available on UAS. So that was just a real quick answer for me on my side. I don't have that many other questions here. If you guys wanted to go ahead and answer a few more or ask a few more while we just have a few more minutes, but I'll turn that back over to you, Fraser.
Sure. Just a quick comment on that. I tend to see the narrow field of view on the Autel sensor as an advantage. If it's being disadvantageous to you, you could just fly from further away. In most scenarios, you can do that. So yeah, the high res of the thermal sensor on the Autel is great, especially for something like an energy audit, because if you want to think about stitching images or making models, you really need high resolution to do that. So the results are going to be way, way better with the Autel.
And one thing I'd like to add there, Fraser, and it's going to be important, especially for the inspection applications, is there actually is now a radiometric version available for the EVO 2 Dual. It's available in Europe and in China. It is not yet here in North America. We think it might be coming soon. But I know all the time we get, why isn't it radiometric? It will be radiometric. That's extremely important for those inspection applications, because the others, or sorry, the ANFI does not have that option. It makes up for it differently with the Zoom. The other part of the EVO 2 Dual is, as Fraser and Andy pointed out with some of those, is there are accessories available for it. Again, in China, I'm told those will be coming to North America at some point. That does include a spotlight, which is great. And I think I also saw a little RTK module on there as well. So potentially really, really interesting applications for that in the inspection. And as we already said, it'll be the best of the three systems for mapping on some of the standard platform. So I'm going to pass it back to Fraser and Andy to kind of wrap up, and then we'll stick around for any questions. And apologize, we've gone a bit over time here.
Yeah, so just wrapping up thoughts on the Mavic. It's a very solid, reliable, versatile system. It's the lowest cost of the ones we tested, and the available options are really great. We saw at least one example of how you can come up with some interesting solutions using those options. The Autel had great flight characteristics. It was new for everyone who looked at it in these tests, and we were all very impressed with it. I think we'd all be happy to own it. It's just great in almost every regard. And for mapping and for inspections, it's likely to perform much better. It's got just way better sensors. Features a little bit more limited in regards to thermal for searching, for example, but the pure quality of the sensor is just really good, and that's going to be an advantage for those types of applications.
And I will add on that, watching all these pilots who'd never flown it, and it was like Christmas. The eyes lit up, and it was, I would say, from a watcher, it was their favorite one to fly.
It's cool. It's a cool system. We were all really excited to see the NFE USA as well. Obviously, it's brand new. We've been waiting for a long time to see that. It was fun to get our hands on it. It performed very well in every test. It's, as we mentioned, it's a new product. It's got some issues that they'll work out. The visual sensors are way better, or at least the zoom capability is way better than the others. That's really a standout feature. The attention paid to security and privacy is, as we all know, it's way beyond what the competitors offer. So if that's a priority for you, you're going to go with the NFE USA because it's checking all the other boxes as well, and it's going to stand way ahead in terms of privacy and security.
And it's also the only one that's IP rated, which is great. And I will say, one of the things, we had our friends, I don't know if Ryan's on here, but we had some friends in Manitoba, friendly Manitoba, inside joke for you guys that got that one. It was actually flight tested version 1 in minus 23 Celsius with like 30-kilometer winds. It was cold.
What's that in Imperial?
It's a lot. It's really cold, and it's a lot of wind. And it started on a full battery, returned after 13 minutes of flight in that temperature with 45% battery. So it has been battle tested already in the frozen, somewhat Green Bay-like tundra.
I flew it in pretty heavy rain. That was fun.
All right.
Yeah, so those are my thoughts. Andy, can you just give us some of your thoughts? When the testing was done, what are your final impressions?
Yeah, thanks, Fraser. One of the things I don't think we mentioned on the Parrot was its camera and its ability to point straight up. So it has able to rotate from vertical straight up to straight down 180 degrees, which the others don't. That's definitely a factor. The other thing we noted was it doesn't have any navigation or operating lights. So if you are flying at night, you'd have to find some kind of another aftermarket accessory to be able to see it, which was a little bit of a downside. The resolution was incredible on the IR, as we've mentioned. Also the color orange, which is unusual color for these systems, but we did find in the daytime, it really does stand out more than some of the gray colors, if that's a priority for you. Overall, though, I think the Mavic Enterprise, as much as it's 2-year-old technology, it's impressive for pretty much half the price of the other systems. And when they do come out with the new firmware upgrade to give you a 4x zoom, that will be a definite benefit. And the smart controller as well was a definite asset to it as well. So that was my findings. Thanks, guys.
All right, so let's throw it back to John, and if you had any other questions or any there we go.
Just a couple of other small questions to basically finish up and wrap up our presentation here. Justin Fletcher is asking if the video will be posted online. Of course, we will have it online, archived in YouTube as well. You can come back here to Vimeo and actually watch it. So yes, we'll be available to actually have this. And if you need to share this with your department or have that ability to do that, we can provide that to you via email or whatever. So make sure you get a hold of the sales team at RMUS if you have any questions on that, or as well as the video being shared to other people for your departments or anything like that. Another one, Shane asks, do any of these systems broadcast in video transmission any higher than 1080? So overall, any broadcast system, I mean, most everything is running in 720 HD simply because of the amount of time. You have to usually split the bandwidth and a number of things like this. It is a little bit more complicated. We see football stadiums and baseball games that are now broadcasting in 4K, but they're all like right there. Cameras are close to each other. They're not trying to broadcast over long ranges or through a lot of things. So there is a challenge there. Hopefully that is able to clean up a little bit, but it's really just a bandwidth challenge more than anything, of trying to get it from the drone and then into the remote or broadcasting it out from the ground. So it's always been a challenge. So, and then. And 1080p is, if something comes in at 1080p, it's still pretty impressive, Jay says, my media guy. He says. A segue into this is Doug's question, because this is actually a really good comment too. Any solutions to stream via HDMI for the Parrot, possibly USB capable iPad? So we didn't really touch too much on broadcasting it to other places, but as we know, I mean, if you didn't know, we know from the Enterprise Smart Remote, there is an actual HDMI port on the back in which you can then broadcast that if you needed to, or connect it to a screen. The Autel doesn't have any way to manage that from the remote itself, but it does have a unit called the Live Deck, which I've actually been playing with the last week or so. So Live Deck is actually receiving the transmission, in which again you can then move it HDMI to a PC or anything like that. So that's really important for spreading the information. And as far as I know, Parrot doesn't have the capability. The best we've been able to do there is use a sharing the screen type app. So AirData has this, being able to share the screen, send it off to a space, and then include that. There's DroneSense can do this. Other apps can share that screen and send it somewhere else. But as far as hard broadcasting from the actual remote, not that I know of as far as an AFI goes. Good possibility that these types of discussions and these types of webinars are super helpful in producing the next step or the next part. So as Kevin had mentioned, radiometry in the Autel, I think that was the first thing I ever addressed almost a year ago when they announced this at CES, is the radiometry capability within there. And I wanted to make sure people really understood what that meant, because it wasn't wasn't radiometric. Sorry, looking for the word there. It wasn't radiometric. So, but it does overall make other good use cases for what people need and what they use. So now that this is a possibility, this really comes down to FLIR. It doesn't come down to Autel, because they are using a boson sensor. That is a development strategy there. So hopefully we can see that in the near future for more of the inspection guys. But I'm just going to take it back to Fraser and Kevin, and again say thank you. If you guys have any last additional comments or anything like that.
No, John, I think it's a really good question about live feeds. I guess we have to say that's another advantage for the Mavic. It's very easy to port out video signal from that HDMI port on the controller. Also, it goes sort of beyond the ease of use. Porting out the signal from the Mavic controller, you're able to remove the on-screen display. So you can take away the battery status and other information and just show a clear camera view. I know that for a lot of our law enforcement customers, their command staff really appreciate having a clear view without these busy screens that us as RPAS operators are used to. They're not, and so it's nice to get that stuff off the screen.
All right. So I want to thank everybody very much for coming. We had a great time putting this together. As I say, we do have the data available. Those of you that are looking at inspection and want to play with the images, everything as Fraser said, we will have a couple of models that have been made available as well. So you can email us, just Fraser at RMUS or Kevin at RMUS or sales at RMUS. Anytime, and we'll get you those. We will be putting together a white paper where we'll summarize some of this data in a PDF format. It is year end, so that will take us a bit of time to get together. It will probably be January, but again, I promise if you email us, we'll keep a file and you will get it together. And of course, we'll look forward to doing additional testing next year. So. Thanks, everybody, for joining. Andy, thank you very much for all your time and helping us out with the testing. And everybody have a great holiday season. Thanks again.
Thanks, guys.
And my final wrap up here, again, basically, again, we really appreciate everybody's input, help, and testing. sales guy, everybody would want that. But anyway, I'm glad that we were able to actually run these tests. These guys did a really amazing job up there in Canada, especially input from Andy. I want to tell him again personally, thank you for involving your perspective overall. So one more time, if you have any questions, Kevin at RMUS, Fraser at RMUS.com, sales at RMUS.com. If you have any bids or anything else about the pricing capability. With the white paper that Kevin is referring to, and as well as any data that they shared today, please reach out before making haste decisions to just buy or purchase something and not knowing exactly what you're getting into. So hopefully this was informative and helpful in that respect. Thank you again for joining us and joining the RMUS team, and we are here to support basically all of our brands, all of our apps, all of our help, training, and everything else. And hopefully that gives you guys some insight on these three systems today, as well as the Skydio.